Noam. I'm the team lead for the team responsible for analytics here in Vulcan. With me is Dan Katz. He's the director of cell engineering. Dan, can you load the slide?
Yes, you got it. You can hear me okay, correct?
I can hear you. I hope the audience as well.
Yeah. All right.
All right, let's go to the first one. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how we leverage analytics to improve remediation, and with it, the security posture of our entire organization. So, in the old days of, 2010, we had a single source of information. It was our scanners. We got a report. These are the scans. You got these vulnerabilities. That's their CVSS score. That's practically it. Any additional information required security professional to go and manually, proactively go search for it online and all of their sources. And they handled it in paper and pen, Excel sheets, text documents, etc. And while it was clear, we as an industry realized it's not enough. Today, we integrate information from so many sources. It can be our infrastructure or CMDB. We have multiple scanning sources for our hosts, our websites, code projects. And we also stepped away from, universal scores like CVSS to something more personalized. We want to prioritize according to our specific organization risk profile. So, we improved our coverage, we do our work better, but it's also much harder to investigate and improve and understand where we're at and how we can get better. And the score today is composite of CVSS. How important is stuff to our organization? Is it an important server? Is it in DMZ? Threat intelligence information, like what the root cause of most of the risk in our company. It's a specific product, a region, a team. Understanding all of those things from the multitude of sources and the heaps of information today is very hard. In Vulcan, we're trying to make it a lot simpler. We have a concept called Biz Groups. It lets us divide the information by company, business, and technical domains. So we can check out, what team is lagging behind. Do we have a region at risk? Maybe a product that used to be problematic showed improvement. You want to know that. You want to know that you can divert your attention someplace else. And, even is it a seasonal thing? Is Christmas coming? Did we have to boot up a ton of servers for the Super Bowl? Like, you need to know all of that to get a holistic view of your system. So our reporting lets you drill down and filter by all the data from all your sources. You don't need to go to that system or that and, pick out and try to create a unified vision of your organization. You get it in a single place, and you get it in a single place in a way that you can dissect it and analyze it and really see where your risk is stemming from. Then let's go to the next slide. We understood where our risk's at, what's causing it, where it's centralized. But modern security teams are measured by their ability to show progress. adhere to SLAs, maintain compliance, and maybe sadly, they're also reliant on other teams. You know, DevOps, development, no longer like a one-team show. And staying on top of things can prove a challenge. And you know, to facilitate improvement and in the way that we are doing our job requires clear data. Everyone today talks about data-driven decisions. We had a lot of talks prior to this one bringing that up. So I'm gonna have a little exercise with you right now. So I'll ask you a simple question. How many vulnerabilities right now in your organization are breaching SLA? Think about it. All right, how many of those are critical, maybe high? You know, I feel that knowing this number should be the most basic thing that all of us need to know about our organization. But today, finding these kind of data points is very hard. Maybe it's hiding in some Excel someone did, or is it hiding in our ticketing system across many teams? So calling back to the Biz Groups we talk about, in Vulcan, you can also configure SLA for each level of vulnerability. You know, is it critical or high? And then you can track it down to the level of the single instance. Is it a server that's breaching SLA, a single line of code, you know, a repository? And again, having all of that information in a single place, let us see it as a whole. Like, let us find where our problems are at and improve. And like all of our reports, it can be dissected and sliced and diced, and maybe you take out only the information that's relevant to the specific team that's problematic, and you can send it to them so they can stay up to date with what they need to do to keep up with SLA. And next slide, Dan. And finally, we reached the holy grail. Last two subjects I talked about are general concepts that are everywhere. Any organization that practices a risk-based approach knows about those things, but really they both stem from a single source. How fast are we able to fix our vulnerabilities? Are we able to fix more vulnerabilities than vulnerabilities are entering our system? You can dance around all the data all you want, but at the end of the day, our risk is going to improve only if we can fix more that we are introducing. Finding the most impactful fixes, analyzing how long it takes to deploy them, what team is doing a good job at deploying, what is holding us back. All of that is the raw data that we need to know what's our future is going to look like, not just how are we doing compared to the past. So I talked about a lot of big concepts, but I want to let Dan show you inside our system how we actually implement all of that in Vulcan. Dan?
Thanks a lot. Appreciate that, Noam. And I'll just do another sound check and a screen check just to make sure everybody can see the demo system here as well as hear my voice. At least you can hear me, correct, Noam?
I can hear you sound.
Great. Cool. So a lot of our customers come to us with some common themes as it relates to reporting, and they're based in a couple of foundational concepts that I've found to be pretty universal against a lot of the customers that I talk to. One is, how can we gather these assets and assign them to the appropriate groups with all of the dynamic environments that we have and all the different characteristics that we can use that would actually assign them to those groups. So host names and subnets and things of that nature. And no, I'm not sure if maybe you got a little feedback on your mic. I don't know if you can maybe mute. Maybe hearing some, appreciate it. So that's one of the major concept is making sense of all the assets. The other thing is being able to track, once we've kind of figured out how we're going to assign assets from multiple sources with multiple characteristics, is track the actual activity in terms of, when it has a critical vulnerability and I've detected it and I prioritized it, I need to actually follow up on whether or not something was remediated. So there's a lot of automation that goes in and reporting that goes into that aspect that I think is kind of undersold in a lot of aspects in terms of how important that is in the overall VM lifecycle. So where I like to usually start before we jump into the actual analytics itself is how we build the foundation of those analytics and make them important. We need those reports to be accurate. We need them to reflect something that actually makes sense that we can deliver per business group. So Vulcan will bring in assets as it relates to your traditional infrastructure that you can see up here as far as your hosts, so your VMs and your servers and things of that nature, your CMDB. Another important aspect of what we're doing with specifically the hosts is being able to identify other characteristics of those assets that come from those different sources and merge where appropriate. So using individual details, AWS instance IDs, things like FQDN and host names. We have a common issue where a lot of customers have, of course, lots of remote machines. They may have a really large ServiceNow CMDB, for example, that has a whole bunch of blank IPs in those CMDB records. Because of the fact that they're the remote devices that are constantly cycling through different IPs. So they need an opportunity to identify when a vulnerability exists on a machine that may have an IP that changes on an hourly basis or at least a daily basis. So the first thing we're going to do is gather all the details that we can from all the different sources, whether that is your collective inventories in AWS, your CMDB, that can provide us things like OS information, as well as your traditional things like just your external network scans or maybe scanning coming from agent-based tools. So once we've done that, we have an opportunity to, instead of duplicating an asset 4 different times, we can merge it across the sources that are actually going to correlate vulnerability data and asset data together. Additionally, we want to bring in other types of assets outside of your traditional your infrastructure. So code projects, things that come from SaaS tools, things that come from your third-party library tools, and assign them to individual code projects and do the same type of grouping that we're talking about, being able to assign criticality levels to them, assign them to different departments, whether that's a code project, a website, or even some of your image-based inventory. So things like Prisma Cloud, AWS ECR, JFrog X-Ray are pretty common examples of how to make sense of all this noise so that once I actually have it in one place, I can actually do something with the reporting aspect. So when we talk about building groups that make sense for our reporting, what we also need to understand is, one, has the work already been done from the tools that we're gathering data from? So one can be AWS, right? Your different ASGs, your different AWS instance IDs and account IDs, all different types of tags that we can gather from existing tools where the existing work has been done. And actually, instead of kind of reinventing the wheel, we're going to replicate that in Vulcan. And we can, again, either assign it with impact or not. One thing that's important about creating these different groups is that we can do so from kind of a departmental standpoint, which is your finance versus your marketing. We can do it from a criticality standpoint, which is obviously your intellectual property, your employee data, your customer data, your financial data. And then, of course, we can do it things by network segments, right? Your DMZ versus your enterprise IT. So being able to understand, what different business units make the most sense. Also, if you have a fully built out CMDB, this is a pretty common request as well. Being able to take fields from those tools to actually create those departmental groups that I was talking about. So we can actually have multiple assigned to users that exist within machines in a CMDB. They may roll up to a managed by user within ServiceNow, which rolls up to a top level department. So we can build these things out based on the tags that come from our connectors. Again, not reinventing the wheel. We can do things like grabbing naming conventions from our host names. So if we want to isolate our production machines just from a traditional asset name standpoint, we can get really granular in terms of whether or not we actually want to dive into some regular expressions, whether we want to use specific subnets that maybe exist in different data centers across the country or across the world, or even following a saved search, which we can build out by asset type or IP, and we can kind of build out very granular saved searches within assets. So once we've done that, when we've done that accurately across all of our different sources and we've made sense of that noise, we've aggregated them, we've merged them where appropriate, now we have a foundation that we can actually begin to report on. So across the platform, we'll actually have these business groups built out, but this is going to be reflected in our analytics tab. And as of right now, we've got 4 major concepts, 3 of which we're focusing on at the moment. risk being probably the most attractive one, the one that I think folks are looking for more than anything. So we have a fully implemented BI inside this analytics tab that allows you to track on a month-to-month basis per business group, what the total risk is. So, what are your vulnerabilities over time? Are you increasing the amount of assets over time? So if you have a spike in terms of how many VMs were spun up, to Noam's point about, maybe there's a holiday or there's a Super Bowl, something like that, where you have additional assets with additional risk, being able to track that and correlate that information into a way where you can actually say, hey, yes, we had introduced risk from, October 1st to October 15th, but that was because we had the spike where we had extra available assets only for that window. So again, providing the accurate groupings of that information prior to jumping into the reporting is really important. And then being able to dive into how each business group is performing, right? So what is it about each business group that is unique, that makes them struggle a little bit more than others? Is it because they have additional assets? Is it because they're just a larger group? Or is there just maybe additional risk? Maybe there's not enough hands-on in that group. Being able to dive into this information is really important in terms of, who gets this information on a week-to-week basis. That could be your CISOs, your management, that could be your board level meetings. So this is something that I think is probably the most utilized aspect of the analytics, being able to really dive into the different criticality levels of the assets, of the vulnerabilities, and isolate them by operating system and kind of create even subgroups, if you will. The other aspect would be through SLA. Now, SLA is something that is set within Vulcan per customer. So depending on what your own internal standards are, you can set your critical high, medium, and low. And once you've set those, the prioritization system that we talked about earlier today is going to drop your vulnerabilities and your assets into various buckets. So critical, high, medium, and low, and then match that against your SLA internal audits that you guys have kind of set for yourselves. And again, this is fully customizable, just like the previous dashboard. So if you want to focus on vulnerability type, your individual business groups, your sources in which these things come from. So a lot of folks actually like to focus on your dynamic result team, your static result team, your infrastructure team. So there's different sources that this data can be provided from that's useful. And of course, the actual date range. So, if you run on a weekly basis, if you run on a month-to-month basis, how did I perform this month versus last month? Those are all pretty valuable metrics as it relates to reporting on these SLAs. What I found to be most important, at least engaging with customers as it relates to SLAs, is, what business groups are producing the most risk. Typically, the one that has the most breaches is going to be the one that has the most critical breaches, but also extracting the numbers of the vulnerability instances within each criticality level of the SLA. So, what percentage of those instances, when we say vulnerability instances, we mean each individual asset that's vulnerable to a specific critical vulnerability. So what percentage of that is actually within the critical, and which percentage of that is breaching versus which percentage of that is actually currently within the SLA. So you still do have eyes on the numbers that are actually still within your view and still meeting your own standards. But again, being able to report on this, export this information, and have it prepared and ready to go for those meetings where metrics are really, really important to identify whether or not you have new employees to hire, or whether or not you need to make some shuffles in terms of where skills are being executed across the organization. The additional one that I like to go through is remediation performance. So this one's kind of interesting. It's new to our platform as well. So this one we're going to continue to evolve. But it's really interesting because it really shows the overall organization's ability to handle incoming vulnerabilities against what they can actually fix in the process. So you have your vulnerabilities by status in terms of what's still vulnerable, what's in fixed, and what's in ignored. We'll talk about a little bit more about this here in a minute. But we'll also look at the age of the criticality levels and what is your mean time to resolution for each criticality level. So what is your average start to finish in terms of the vulnerability lifecycle of a critical vulnerability, a high vulnerability, a medium, or a low? Now, just keep in mind, this is a demo environment. We have deliberately old assets. So you're going to see really wide windows here. This is not what you want to see, of course, in a live environment. The other thing that I think is really interesting is your remediation capacity. So, how much vulnerability information is introduced on a day-to-day, a week-to-week, or a month-to-month basis versus what you are capable of remediating. And again, this can come back to skills. This can come back to team size. This can come back to ephemeral assets, things that they're not being managed appropriately. There's a lot of reasons that we can have spikes in this information, but we're not going to know about, we're not going to know where to look if we don't have this information presented to us in a nice view that we can actually analyze. So with that, I'd like to flip over to another one of the main complaints that I think that we hear from customers that are onboarding with us is not only is it difficult to gather all your assets from all the sources and merge all your assets from all the sources, but it's also difficult to track when you're actually executing a workflow from start to finish of these different vulnerabilities. What is the status of that? Is it open? Is it closed? Are the vulnerabilities fixed? Are they vulnerable? And if they're recurring, do I have a tracking method to understand why I keep introducing the same vulnerabilities on the same machines? So we have this function that's kind of built into the reporting functions called campaigns, which is an automated audit trail of all of the actions that are either taken through automated playbook functions or manual actions in our platform. So if you have, a specific action that you've taken, whether that's opening a ticket through Jira or ServiceNow, triggering scripts through Ansible or Chef, being able to track the progress of that is really, really important. And actually have an audit trail of all of the vulnerabilities that were closed over the course of a given year is still really, really valuable. Of course, at the end of the year, analyzing how the team did, where you need to make hires, if not. So tracking the action, the overall vulnerabilities that were included in a specific campaign, the assets that were affected, and whether or not those assets have actually moved into an archive status, which is another important aspect of what we do as it relates to active vulnerabilities and active assets that are still in the system. So we have an archive window, which we can really either shorten or lengthen depending on how ephemeral the assets can be, how long assets are typically live. If you have a really dynamic environment where assets are going into archive status, on a daily basis, we can accommodate that by lowering the archive window so that when you have an active campaign, it's not going to sit here in open status while you have a bunch of assets that don't exist anymore, right? So being able to automate the process of tracking this and then creating that audit trail so that I can search for it, at any given time later in the year. So if I want to look, at specific vulnerabilities that keep popping up, what I did in that previous attempt, how I remediated it, a record of that is really important. Ultimately, this information, whether the vulnerabilities are in vulnerable or fixed status, whether those campaigns are in open or closed status, the tickets that are associated, all of that's connected and will be reflected in your analytics. So your overall risk being presented to the environment and your overall remediation performance is all reflected through those components. Those are, I think, some of the major challenges that I kind of keep hearing on an engagement to engagement basis. The other thing that I like to mention is the ability to get a data-centric output of this information. So if I want to look at, I've got this critical Windows external facing group that has an 84 risk. And this one, some of these other ones are test groups, and this is one I know is going to be real, but I actually want to dive into. So we have the ability to actually, at any point, once we've created those groups, assuming we've created them accurately, and it's also important to mention that these groups are based on rules that will automatically update all of those different assets and where they're supposed to go. So once you create that, it's not something that you have to edit on a day-to-day basis. But what I can do is just jump in, find that specific group, identify exactly how many of the vulnerabilities are in vulnerable or fixed status from any of these tabs, and I can actually export that and work from it. So if I want to go ahead and just get this group, get all of my vulnerable, unique vulnerabilities with their individual asset collections and the ones that are fixed, I can actually export that as a CSV and work from that. If somebody were to press me on the report and say, hey, I need to know exactly what machines are part of this group. Why is it presenting so much risk to my environment? What are the types of vulnerabilities? What are the types of operating systems? So we can also dive further. So if I wanted to say, all right, within this 871, I want to know how many of them are Red Hat, right? And then within this, I want to know how many of them actually exist at a critical level. So I can do this again to export that, and provide a data-centric report to anyone that's pressing on the analytics of the reports itself. And I can also save this for later use. So if I want to say all critical, and let's say we are on Red Hat and critical. So I can save this, and that will be there for an export at any time later on. If whoever's asking me for that report is somebody that needs that on a weekly or a monthly basis, I have that function. The other thing to mention as it relates to getting data out of the platform in terms of being able to really work with data and really get down into the nitty gritty if you really need to, we are built on a REST API. So at any given time, if you want to gather any of the information that I was just going through in terms of what's vulnerable, what's fixed, what's ignored, what is of a Red Hat operating system, what is critical, This is also available to be pinged via the API and extracted and used in all kinds of different ways as well. This is another request that we get for just all kinds of custom use cases. So that API is available to be used for all sorts of different use cases on top of the analytics function. And it's just something that I wanted to mention in terms of how we can extract very specific information from those analytics that will correlate to the report and again, correlate to the open campaigns in terms of what the overall remediation performance is for each organization. And that was a lot. I know I kind of just burned through some stuff, but those are the major subjects that I really wanted to cover. And with that, I think I will hand it back to Rhett. And of course, I will check the chat. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Just something I wanted to add.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Noam. Yeah, Noam, did you have a last comment there?
Just one last comment. Thank you, Dan. It was great. Analytics is a core concept here in Vulcan. We believe in data-driven decision, making you do the best work you can. So we're constantly updating our offering. We're adding more reports, more data, more customizability. So yeah, many great things coming from in that section in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, there's something to be said for a platform like Vulcan that takes all the different inputs from, scan to fix, as we like to say, and gives you that single view into the status of these remediation campaigns and the progress that is being made towards actually getting fixed done and getting stuff secured, vulnerabilities addressed and remediated in your within your infrastructure. And so that's what we're working to deliver here at Vulcan. And so hopefully you got a really good sense of that over the last few hours through the Remediation Summit. And just like to sign off at this point. Thank you for everybody for attending. Really appreciate our special guests who were able to present, our customers that were able to share insights into their environments and how they're using Vulcan to get fix done and to remediate vulnerabilities in their infrastructure. And thank you, Dan, Noam, as well for your insights and content here. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for joining.